Hello and welcome to the lecture for Chapter 10. So in the first part of my lecture for this chapter, I'm going to talk about installment notes, which if any of you have purchased a car with car payments, you'll know what an installment note is. So we'll talk about that. It's a very common type of lending that a lot of businesses engage in. I'll talk briefly about line of credit, although there isn't too much content on that. And then I will get into a bit of the bond overview. So I'll talk about that a little bit, and then on the next lecture we'll go into bonds in detail, talking about discounts and premiums and redemptions. So we'll cover that in the second lecture for this chapter. So first of all, installment notes. That's usually issued by a single bank. So your business might go to Bank of America or Wells Fargo or a local bank to finance the purchase of an asset. And generally that asset is held as collateral for the loan. And you make payments over a period of time, over 3 years, 36 months, or 5 years, or whatever the length of time is that you negotiate for the loan. The bank then will tell you what the payment will be on that loan. And the key thing about installment loans, or installment notes rather, are all of the payments are for the same amount. So if you finance something over 36 months, you'll make 36 monthly payments, and all of these payments will be the exact same dollar amount. So with each payment, a certain portion is going to be applied to interest on the loan, and a certain portion is going to be applied to the principal, or the amount that you owe. And that's going to change with each payment because the interest is on the outstanding principal at that moment in time. So as you pay against the principal, you're going to reduce that. So in the beginning, the interest portion of payments is larger and the principal portion is smaller. And then that switches over time towards at the end of the loan, the principal portion is much larger than the interest portion because, again, the interest is on the declining balance of the principal of the loan. So we need to prepare something called an amortization schedule to figure out what the mix is on each of those payments. So I'll go through it now, and then I will also record doing problem exercise 10-2A, which details going through one of those amortization schedules, and that'll be part of your homework. So I'll demonstrate that in a separate short video. So here's an example of an amortization table. So this is a 5-year loan where you're making annual payments just to kind of keep it more simple. But you can see this company borrowed $24,000. The note carried 6% interest. It started on January 1st, and you can see it's a 5-year note. So at the beginning of that, the carrying amount on January 1 is $24,000. That's column A. The payment that the bank determined of $56.98 is the same for all 5 periods. I'll also post a loan amortization spreadsheet, which you can play around with a little bit, that shows you how that $56.98 is determined. So you could plug this information into that spreadsheet that you'll find on Moodle, and you would come up with that same exact payment for an annual payment. So the key thing here is column C. We're going to calculate what portion of that $56.98 payment relates to interest expense. So that's going to be based on the fact that during that whole year, we owed $24,000. So in this case, we would take $24,000 times 6%. Because it's for a full year, we would say times 12 over 12, or just times 1. But that's important to keep in mind that it's for a period of time. So if you do one of these schedules and it's by month, then you'd be multiplying by 1/12 for each month. Okay, but in this case, it's for a full year. So 24,000 times 0.06 is 1440. So the $56.98 payment, 1440 of that is associated with interest expense. So the difference, B minus C of 4258, is what is going to go towards reducing the principal on the loan. So with that reduction of 4258, that leaves our new carrying amount after this payment at 19,742. That's 24,000 column A minus 4258 column D. So 19,742 becomes our beginning carrying amount next year, and we owe that for the entire year. So then in year 2, we're multiplying 19,742 times 6%, and we get a lower amount of interest because the principal is lower. So that means the amount that goes towards the principal increases to 4,513. So now our principal balance is 15,229, 19,742 minus 4,513. We continue that same pattern all the way down until we get to the last year. And that last year, just because of rounding differences, we're not dealing with pennies or portions of pennies here. So because of that rounding difference, we want to make sure that the number that's in the lower right corner of column E there, 0, we want to make sure that's 0. So sometimes we have to fudge the interest expense figure so that 324 is probably off by $1 or $2 because of rounding. So we determined 324 because we needed that figure in column D to be 5,374. We needed the principal reduction to equal the amount of the carrying amount of the loan, the 5,374. So we backed into the 324 of interest, and that leaves us with the loan paid off then. So we need this information because when we're recording that payment of $56.98 each year, I need to know how much of that I'm going to apportion interest expense and how much I'm going to reduce the note payable. So if you take this amortization schedule, which I would need to do for every installment loan I have for the company, either the bank would give it to me or I would make it myself, so that I could put it into my transaction grid like we've been working on here. So in this case, you can see the payment that's made at the end of the first year there, cash is reduced by $56.98. The note payable is reduced by $42.58. That was the amount of principal reduction we identified in our worksheet there. And then retained earnings is reduced by $14.40, the amount of interest expense. So again, I'll work through one of these examples in the video practice for exercise 10-2A, and hopefully between my explanation, that video, and doing it yourself, it'll make sense to you. So just briefly on lines of credit, I don't have a slide for that, but a line of credit is a type of loan. Sometimes it's called a revolving line of credit. It's a loan with a bank where you can borrow up to a certain amount. And whenever you have surplus cash, you can apply it against that loan and pay it down. Interest at any point is determined by the average balance during a particular month, and they charge you interest that you have to pay. And then again, you can borrow from it, which increases cash and increases the line of credit, a type of debt. And then payments against it would decrease cash and decrease the line of credit. So it's a pretty flexible type of borrowing. Generally only applicable for short-term needs, not for financing asset purchases. So the last thing I want to talk about in this lecture is bonds. And bonds can trip up a lot of students. When I was sitting in your seat a long time ago, I didn't like bonds at all. I thought they were kind of stupid that we had to study them, and I resented it. And now I kind of like the subject because I think the math in it is kind of interesting. So what bonds are a way for large organizations like the state of Washington or the school I used to teach at, South Puget Sound Community College, or big companies to borrow more money than a particular bank might want to loan out. So as an example, the state of Washington, if they wanted, or when they did build a second bridge in Tacoma to Gig Harbor, then the second Narrows Bridge, when they wanted to build that bridge, they needed a lot of money to erect that bridge. It cost a lot to do that, of course. So where's that money going to come from? Well, the money's going to come from people paying tolls as they drive across the bridge over the next 30 or 40 years, okay? Well, the problem is the State Department of Transportation needs the money now to pay for the bridge, okay? So they issued bonds, which means they're borrowing from the general public. They're essentially going to the general public and saying, we need to borrow money to buy a bridge. We're good for it. We're going to be able to make payments. So please loan us money. And so by investing in bonds, you're loaning an entity money. If you buy treasury bills, that is debt for the U.S. federal government. So you're loaning the U.S. federal government money that you believe you'll get paid back down the road. So that's what it is. An example with SPSEC, they wanted to build a health center for students, which students agreed to charge themselves a surcharge per credit to pay for over time. So the college issued a bond to fund the construction of a health center, workout club kind of a place, and then it'll be paid off over time as students charge themselves that fee. So that's what bonds are. They're large borrowings from the general public. They're usually done in increments of $1,000. So the issuer is the seller of the bond, the borrower. So in that case, let's use an example, SPSEC. The bondholder is the person that purchases the bond or invested by loaning them that money. So that might be your grandparents who do that as part of their retirement savings, or your parents, or some other institutional investor might do that lending. The principal is the face amount of the bond. So if you purchase a $1,000 bond, you're loaning $1,000 to that entity, and that's the principal amount. The term is a date at which the bonds mature. So it could be a 5-year bond, meaning it pays off in 5 years, or it could be a longer term bond, 15, 20 years, that sort of thing. The stated interest rate is the interest rate that's indicated on the face of the bond. So if you were to buy a $1,000 bond for SPSEC's Health Center, it might state on there that it pays 3.5% interest. So that is the interest payment that you'll receive either every 6 months or every year, depending on the terms of the bond. So the way that works is, say you invest, you buy a $1,000 bond for SPSEC to build their health center. So you give them $1,000, they give you a piece of paper that says that they owe you that $1,000. That's the bond. So they're going to pay you 3.5% interest, just to keep it simple, say every year. So they'll give you a check for, I think that's, $350? No, $35. Every year, they'll pay you the interest at the end of every year. And then at the end of 5 years, they'll pay you your $1,000 back. So you get interest along the way, and then when the bond matures, you get the full amount back. Now, when companies issue or entities issue bonds, their intent is that the interest rate that they choose is equal to the interest rate that investors feel they deserve based on the risk associated with that issuer of bonds. So if you were going to buy a bond for the U.S. federal government, you might assess that as a very low level of risk. It's highly unlikely that the federal government's going to go out of business and you're not going to get your money. So you would be willing to accept a low interest rate for that bond because there's less risk associated with it. On the other hand, say Tesla, they issued bonds to build their battery factory in the Southwest, their Gigafactory. And you might think, well, there's a lot more risk associated with Tesla than there is the U.S. federal government. So I'm going to require a higher interest rate to offset that risk, that maybe they'll go bankrupt and I won't get my money or something like that. So when companies issue bonds, they do a lot of research to determine how investors are going to view them with regard to risk, and then they issue it at a stated interest rate that they hope is equal to the market rate. So the market rate is what investors expect. So there's 3 different scenarios we're going to talk about. So the first scenario is the middle one there. The company or the entity guesses correctly and they issue bonds with a contract rate that equals what the public is expecting. So in that case, they are sold at what's called the face amount. So I say I want to borrow $1,000, and you say I'll invest in your bond. I'll pay you $1,000 because I think the interest rate is fair. Okay, that's a normal situation. Sometimes entities don't guess exactly right. So if they guess, for example, too low, so maybe the market rate for SPSEC is 3.5%. they misread that and they issue it at 2.5%. Well, now investors are not going to be willing to pay the full $1,000 because they want their 3% regardless. So in that case, they would pay less for the bond. So they might pay $950 for that $1,000 bond. They'll still get the interest based on $1,000 on the contract amount. They'll still get $1,000 back when the bond matures, but they'll pay less up front. So the entity that issues the bond will have sold it at a discount. They'll get less money than what they owe. The reverse could be true as well. It could sell at a premium. So if you offer a contract rate that's great, that's much better than the market rate. So say SPSEC issues a bond when the market rate is 3.5%, maybe they don't know that perfectly and they issue it at 5%. Now people are going to spend or be willing to pay more than $1,000 for that because they're willing to settle for 3.5%, but it's paying 5%. So in that case, the bond would sell at a premium. So we'll talk in the next lecture about kind of how to handle the simple situation in the middle and then how we deal with discounts and premiums. So, and that will conclude the lecture. Oh, and then we'll talk about how to redeem bonds, which is how to buy them back, take them off the market. So that's the end of this particular lecture. So I hope all is well with you, and I will talk to you again in the second half of Chapter 10. Thank you.